Hi everyone, here is Emmanuelle Mathieu. I'm presenting this paper recently published in Regulation and Governance. The paper discusses policy coherence versus regulatory governance as alternative possible explanations to policy effectiveness, the effectiveness of pro-investment policies in developing countries. The starting point of this study is the strong assumption that exists both within the literature and within the policymaking community about independent regulatory agencies, IRAs, being an effective way to attract private investment, including in developing countries. So the paper questions this assumption based on the comparison of two case studies in the electricity sector. So it's a comparison of electricity privatization reforms, the major goal of which is to attract private investment in order to expand the electricity generation capacity. And this is comparison of these policy reforms in two countries, in Algeria and in Morocco. Algeria has adopted the standard British liberalization model, combined with the creation of an independent regulatory agency. Morocco has followed a different path. They have not liberalized, they have not created an IRA, they have instead adopted the single buyer model, which is an alternative to liberalization that is generally appreciated in developing countries. What is the outcome of that? Interestingly, the policy had a lot of success in Morocco, with many investors coming to Morocco to invest in the renewable energies privatization policy, and no investor coming to Algeria under the liberalization policy regime. So how can we explain this counterintuitive outcome? The argument that this paper makes is that it depends on policy coherence. The policy coherence is about the complementarity and synergies between different elements. First, between policy goals and policy instruments, and also between the different policy instruments that compose the policy package. So the complementarity between these different elements that relate to the policy package are what I call internal policy coherence. And then this policy package also interacts with the broader political and economic context in which they are embedded. And this interaction can be more or less complementary. So this aspect, the complementarity of the policy package with the context, is what I refer to as external policy coherence. Now, more concretely, the causal mechanisms underpinning the policy coherence approach relies on the incentives received by stakeholders. So designing a coherent policy is about making sure that different incentives received by the stakeholders converge or complement each other, or at the very least, that these different incentives do not contradict or neutralize each other. Now, there is one particular manifestation of the external policy coherence mechanism that is specific to autocratic countries, which I want to detail here because, as you will see, it is relevant in the cases studied. Designing an externally coherent policy in autocratic countries requires avoiding conflict between policy implementation and the long-term interests of the ruling elites. Indeed, when the implementation of a policy implies an outcome that contradicts the interests of the ruling elites, given the elites' informal capacity to bypass formal institutions and impose their preferences, they are able to undo the policy or to neutralize its implementation in order to protect their interests. So when there are such conflicts, policy failure is very likely. Let's turn now to the case studies. starting with Algeria. Algeria has adopted a liberalization approach. And in developing countries, this generally requires raising retail tariffs. In Algeria, this competence was given to the electricity IRA, which is responsible for regulating retail tariffs. But in general, in developing countries, retail tariffs are subsidized. So it's rising retail tariffs is a very unpopular measure, which is very likely to foster social and political unrest. So in such countries, following up on policy reforms and actually raising retail tariff, which is needed for the reform to work, comes with significant political costs. And now, more specifically about Algeria, in the years following the liberalization reforms, so in the 2000s, oil prices rose continuously. And the Algerian economy is very dependent on oil and gas exports. So rising oil price means that the revenues of the Algerian government have increased significantly during this period. So this enormous financial leeway that came from these gas exports has allowed the Algerian government to continue subsidizing retail tariff quite effortlessly and to reduce their need for private investment. So for Algeria, following up during this period in the late 2000s, following up on the policy reforms comes with significant political costs that can easily be avoided with short-term alternatives that have been made possible thanks to oil price increase. This alternative being just not raising retail tariff and continue subsidizing it with the rent coming from the gas. So this combination of a developing country and a rentier economy provides for Algerian ruling elite the incentive to neutralize the policy. And since it's an autocratic country, the ruling elite has the possibility to neutralize the policy implementation. And this is exactly what happened. The government has used its informal influence to prevent the IRA to execute its mandate and actually raising tariffs. This led to implementation failure. In Morocco, we have the single buyer model, which has different requirements for working, for being effective. A key success factor of the single buyer model lies in the state providing strong guarantees that the electricity that will be produced by the investor will be effectively paid at the agreed price during the whole period of the contract, which is generally between 20 and 30 years. So it's an important commitment, financial commitment for the state, which obviously comes with important financial costs. But these costs, given the particular situation of Morocco, which is a net importer of energy, these costs are lower, end up to be lower than what they would be without this investment policy. So, in other words, following up on the policy in Morocco is expected to reduce the energy bill for the state. So this constitutes a very strong incentive to support the policy. And indeed, we see that the authorities have provided very strong support to the institution in charge of implementing this policy. And this led to a significant success. Now let's turn to the comparative analysis. So this is a table summing up the data and presenting the comparison between both cases. So we have an IRA that has been created in Algeria, not in Morocco. We have a high level of internal policy coherence in both countries. We have a difference, though, regarding external policy coherence. In Algeria, we have a contradiction between the policy implementation and the ruling elite's interests. And we have a convergence in Morocco. So in other words, external policy coherence is low for Algeria and high for Morocco. And this is reflected, this leads to policy failure in Algeria and policy success for Morocco. So here we see that IRA is that the creation of an IRA is completely unrelated to policy success, and that instead it is policy coherence that mattered. A few words to conclude. IRAs are as such irrelevant. So this does not mean that IRAs are useless. Rather, it means that their effectiveness is dependent on the policy and the broader context in which they are embedded. So IRAs do not have any kind of absolute effectiveness that could be studied or evaluated independently from their environment. So this leads me to adopting and also advocating a holistic approach to policy effectiveness. And one way of doing so is the policy coherence approach that I present in this paper. And I will end this presentation with a recommendation to the international policymaking community. So it might be good to limit the emphasis placed on preconceived policy solution. And instead, this paper suggests that it shall be worthwhile dedicating efforts into fostering developing countries' capacity to design coherent policies. Thank you very much for listening, and congratulations if you have reached this point of the presentation and if you are still with me. So it was a pleasure to present you this the results of this work. I hope that you found it interesting, and please do not hesitate to drop me an email in case you're interested to discuss these topics with me. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.